So I look forward to sharing this, and thanks so much for having me. Yeah, I think we're all forced into a bit of a corner last year, and it forced us to do some new and innovative things, some of which we've seen in the past, some of which were new. And I'm just going to take us on a little journey of how we've done that in both my current institution and in my former institution, Griffith. But first of all, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, and for Charles Darwin University, we do acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting and pay respect to their elders, past, present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples. And particularly in my case, I'm standing on the land of the Larrakia people. And we are, unlike some universities, Charles Darwin University pays particular honour to their people in whatever area in the Northern Territory we are, because we see that as being part of the Australian, as part of the Northern Territory experience, and that is fundamental to the way in which we embed practices within our curriculum. So this is not just a statement we make, it's actually something we believe and try and work out through our curriculum. Just by way of introduction, as you know, no secrets that over the last 18 months, we've learned a lot of lessons moving online very quickly. Some of those have been good, some of them not so good. We've seen some pretty shonky practice out there as well as some really good practice. And so a lot of that is, of course, based on whether we have an established framework. So one of the things we're doing at our university straight away, what we're doing at the moment is we had a lockdown up here week before last, and it highlighted again to us that we have to have these emergency plans in place so that when things like this happen again, and they will happen again in some form or other, we are ready to rock and roll with whatever strategy we put in place. And part of that is establishing a framework for how you do online learning and teaching and what the relationship with your face-to-face teaching is. But for many institutions, this is not a new thing. For those institutions that have been predominantly distance education institutions for a long time, I mean, Charles Darwin is one of those. I worked at the University of Southern Queensland for 26 years, actually, and I was the Director of Learning Environments and Media there. And 75% of our students are distance. Similar up here in Charles Darwin, about 70% of our students are distance education. And so the institutions that have been working in this online space for quite some time have some fairly well-established frameworks, but that's not always the case for other institutions. And so what we do see also is that the digital ecologies that have evolved over the last, particularly over the last probably 10 years, are changing because the way in which we are now teaching online is changing. And so I'm going to look at some of those trends. The main trend, though, in our online education is that we don't treat it the same as we treat face-to-face education. It is dealing with implementing more active, authentic, collaborative modes of teaching and assessment, because that's what we come to expect now in the online space. It's not simply a matter of putting up a video and putting up some documents to read and testing that with quizzes, even though those may serve a purpose, like a MOOC or something like that. If we are wanting to give the value add to our students, that's the kind of the very, very bare minimum. And there are other activities around that that we need to embrace. And so we're seeing new tools emerging in the online space, and I'll touch on some of those as we go through. And as I said just prior to that, it's not about mimicking the face-to-face, it's actually about understanding the value add of online and where that sits within your business model as an institution. So some institutions have a business model around the face-to-face experience, and that's fine. And they supplement that with some online education, maybe. There are other institutions that are fully online. And then there are, of course, those who there's a huge variant in between. And so part of the reason we're doing this, and all institutions are moving this way, is because of this notion that there's a fourth gen kind of industrial revolution that we're all trying to come to terms with, and that is basically works around the concepts of communication, collaboration, and access to information. So before I go on though, I just want to look at some antecedents, where we were and where we have emerged to over the last probably 10 years and probably a bit less than that. So with our learning systems, our learning management systems, and a lot of the system e-portfolios, things like that, we were mostly institutions were housing these on their own servers, whether it be a cloud service or whether it be a institutional-based service. But over the last few years, we've seen a huge move to what's known as SaaS, or software as a service, whereby all institutions are working off the same version of that software. So regardless of if I'm at Charles Darwin or Griffith or Western Sydney University, all those institutions are working off exactly the same software, just with their branding and things like that. So it makes it a lot easier for a company to service that software, and it makes it a lot easier for the institutions to know what's coming across the horizon at them. At the same time, with this software as a service, we've seen a shift in the way in which we link other systems into our systems. So traditionally, we've seen it through what's known as API, or an application program interface. So we would design a bit of middleware, a bit of software, so that each system would speak to each other. We've now moved to this notion of more learning technology interoperability, or LTI, and extendable APIs, which provide these cloud services with information so they can actually interface with each other and share information across each other in a much simpler way than we did with the old API way of doing things, which was fairly code intensive and needing to update the code every time you implemented a new system or an update to the system. With the LTIs and XAPIs, we find that to be much easier and less. The onus then goes back onto the vendor rather than on the institution having to do this to fit with their self-hosted system. We then moved to this thought that pedagogically, in a sense, we've moved from this transmission of information, where that old face-to-face model of standing in front of the lecture for 2 hours, 3 hours, and then maybe doing a recording of that lecture for 2 or 3 hours, to much more participatory creation of information and the co-creation of information, peer learning, peer assessment, things like that. So that transition has not fully happened yet, but many institutions, it is well on the way to happening. Next, we have this thought that we did move from this walled garden approach, where everything was contained within the learning management system. And we wanted to keep students in that space. We kind of herd them into this walled garden, do everything within that walled garden, and hope that they don't kind of escape and get out of this walled garden. Instead, now we've got this notion of an open garden approach, where we're starting to see that interoperability across different platforms and allowing different gardens, in a sense, to flourish. And so we're seeing that happen with the technologies that we're using, but also with the approach to being able to be far more participatory in our creation of learning and teaching. We're seeing models like students as partners models and things like that, where the students are playing a lot more active role in the design of curriculum and things like that. So much more open in terms of our approach. If we're thinking about the current suite of technologies, the majority, if not all, institutions are employing within the Australasian sector. Of course, I speak from the viewpoint of ACODE there, who I represent also. We know that at the top of that clock there, we have the learning management system, and every institution has a learning management system, whether that be Moodle, Blackboard, Canvas, Desire to Learn. Every institution has a learning management system. And that still forms the basis of our main place in which we conduct our learning and teaching, apart from the lecture and the tutorial room, of course, but this is in terms of technology enhanced learning. If we move round to about 1:30 there, we start to see, or about 2 o'clock really, isn't it? But we see that there's this rise of things called productivity tools and communication tools. Things like Microsoft Teams and Slack, Google Sites and things like that, where students can actually work together in more natural ways to them. So where the learning management system has had discussion forums, which are pretty linear and pretty difficult to negotiate in many cases. And that was how we started with distance education and this notion that we've got this constructivist learning approach, and we're going to use discussion forums to get students interacting with each other. But it's all very text-based and linear, and we've seen over recent years that that's probably not as productive as it could be, and students tend to avoid them unless there's marks associated with them. We see now that there's this notion of productivity and this thought that students can actually be a productive part of their learning and teaching, not just recipients of information and sharing some things when they feel as though they can. But the incorporation of these things called productivity tools like Microsoft Teams allow our students to approach their learning and teaching, and by consequence, of course, our lecturers, allow us to approach our teaching in a far more collaborative way. The way these systems are structured is around this notion that we are working as teams, and we're sharing information, we're co-constructing information, but at different levels, and the way in which we can bring different tabs and different sites into that environment, shared documents, OneNotes, things like that, that we can make far more a space where students can work together. Unlike, we suppose in the old days, we used a wiki to do that. But now we've got so many more options that allow students to work together. And we're seeing a rise of that astonishingly, really. When I was at Griffith just last year, we had over 600 units or courses units using Microsoft Teams, whereas the year before we had none. We did a trial, we did a pilot of Microsoft Teams in our T3, which is the summer trimester. Then all of a sudden it took off, and we had, by the end of last year, we had over 600 units of study using Teams within their learning and teaching. That was an astonishing growth, and has continued to be so. As we move around the clock a bit further, we all have content management systems, that is those things that hold those bits of data for us, the documents, artifacts for us that we can serve out to many different areas. We have, of course, our lecture capture systems and media streaming platforms like Kaltura, Panoptos and the Echo 360s and things like that. Moving further around, e-portfolios, which play an important part, particularly in disciplines like education and nursing, which are heavy users of e-portfolios, and the way in which we evidence our learning. And then moving back around, of course, we've got our virtual conferencing tools, just like we're using now, and virtual classroom technologies like Blackboard Collaborate and things like that, that allow us to interface with each other in a more personal way with the face and the voice and things like that. Of course, surrounding all those things now, we have this data. Data is gold, and how we're using these data to create pictures for ourselves of how the students are reacting within these systems. And now, because of these LTIs and XAPIs, a lot of that data can be gathered together. And that feeds back into our student curriculum management systems and things like that, that mediate who is involved in our systems. Around that outside, of course, is this more porous layer of things like social media platforms. For those that still use things like Facebook, we tend not to use things like Facebook because they tend to expose people to other things that we don't really want them exposed to. And it forces people to have an account with Facebook and things. And so we tend not to recommend that to anybody. There's the web apps and educational tools. There's thousands of them out there. Of course, Microsoft Teams has their own kind of suite of things as well within apps and things like that. There's, of course, the burgeoning of open education resources we've seen over recent years, and the way in which we're promoting our academics to publish more in open source environments rather than closed content. Third-party and streaming services like YouTube's and those things, Vimeo's, professional identity platforms like LinkedIn, etc. And then, of course, our academic integrity tools and our writing assistance tools that help students understand if if their grammar's right or if they're plagiarizing and things like that. So we're seeing this as a fairly consistent suite of technologies that we're using across our learning and teaching environment. And that, of course, is mediated by what mode of delivery we are choosing, whether it's a blended, fully online, flipped models, open learning, hybrid models, whatever you want to call them. And of course, in all those, there are these fundamental aspects that need to be present within our environments. That is, the fundamentals of what I'm going to study in this course. The students want to know what they want to study. They want to know what their assessments are. They want to know where they're going to get support from. Then they're going to know where to access the resources from. And these are all contained within the learning environment. And of course, then the activities, assessment tasks, how they're going to communicate, and of course the evaluation of and the improvement, subsequent improvement, once the students have given us feedback on what that is. And so there are a number of genres, I suppose you could say, of technology-enhanced learning that have evolved and are continuing to evolve based on that previous model I showed you of the different systems and the way in which those different elements interact together. I mentioned this rise of this productivity system, and this is the way I like to conceive it. That we have our undergraduates who come in to study and they need a little bit of extra scaffolding. And so we're using an LMS and associated tools to provide that scaffolding. It's a lot more. It is that walled garden, but we're trying to then see that walled garden start to be less of a wall over time. We know that in many cases, a lot of schools, and particularly we know the public schools use a learning management system, and they use other things, but they use a learning management system. And so students aren't coming in completely blind as to what a learning management system is. Maybe some of the more mature age students haven't had that experience, but that's why that heavy scaffolding is in place at first year level. That we know, of course, through to postgrad, we use our learning management system to host our assessments and things like that. And of course, in the workplace, not many people use the learning management system, It's not widely used. I mean, they might have some smaller tools that allow for some professional development, but generally, workplaces aren't using a learning management system. We have Office 365, Google, things like that, Slack, but we know that most schools in Australia, for example, now are using Office 365. And so we can feel fairly confident that as we move students through to the world of work, we know that in the workplace, these are the tools they're using. So in a sense, it's incumbent upon us to be able to work with students to get them into that collaborative mode of working as to the same as what they'll use in KPMG or whatever it might be that they're going to be working in, or government or whatever. They're all using these tools. And so really it's a matter of us being able to use those tools in such a way as students can actually hit the ground running when they get there. And of course, there are other workplace technology tools. If you're an engineer, you'd be using CAD. If you're an accountant, you might be using Mind Your Own Business or whatever it might be. There are so many different tools that are used professionally, but we also obviously need to use them, and we do to a great extent, use them within our learning teaching environment. Now, because we've had this big move to online, TEXA, the Tertiary Education Quality and Standards Agency, did bring out a guidance note back in 2019 that talked about technology-enhanced learning and what the importance of that was. Now, they brought out other guidance notes more recently about online learning and about collusion, plagiarism, and all that kind of thing. Academic integrity is the word I'm looking for. And so these documents are the way in which the regulator flags to us that they are interested for universities, for institutions to take seriously this space. And so as we move towards adopting more online learning, they're interested in the fact that what we're doing is similar, if not the same or equivalent, let's say equivalent, to what we're doing in the face-to-face environment, which is the traditional way of doing things. So TEXA have started to pay particular interest to this notion of technology-enhanced learning and online learning. And so particularly in relation to those fully online courses, and to guarantee, if you like, how can institutions say hand on heart, what we're doing in that online space is what the that the student getting that online degree is going to have that same level of qualification as the student who has done it in a more traditional way. And that comes down to the assessments and the way in which we are validating, in a sense, our students' experience. We have had a grace period over recent years from TECSA in relation to that, because they've been dealing mostly with the academic integrity thing and the new, bringing out the new standards. But increasingly, we will see TECSA becoming more active in this space again as these other things start to mediate their way through. And so we can't really rest on our laurels, and I don't think any institution can honestly say that they can rest on their laurels in this space just yet. We do see that there are different levels of technology-enhanced learning, though, also that we need to consider, and across the globe I'm talking here, and that there is largely dependent on educational jurisdiction, the national technology infrastructure, you know, the difference between what we can do in Australia, what can be done in Northern India or China or whatever, the geographical constraints of many of these things, these places, the level of staff training that's involved in making sure that student staff are being able to use these tools themselves, and then of course train their students. So we see at the very base level, there's this notion of technology-enabled learning. That is, just being able to use technology to enable some access to learning, whether that be through use of WhatsApp, or whether it be a learning management, simple learning management system or something like that. There's then this notion that there's technology-enhanced learning, where we start to take that to the next level and start to use these more collaborative tools and things like that. And at the very center of that, there's this thing called technology-intensive learning. And that is where we're starting to use artificial intelligence. So we're starting to use those bots to help students with the basic stuff. We are starting to use AR, VR, XR, MR, all these R's in there to help us convey the concepts we want to our students in new and innovative ways. So that's more the technology-intensive learning. Regardless of that, there are certain things we need to have in place if we're going to do that. And I go back to that original concept I mentioned in terms of the framework. How is the institution mediating this, and what are the things they put around it to actually make sure that all their staff are on the same page? So there are some key elements to technology-enhanced learning quality. And we are talking about quality. We're talking about the fact that there is a technology-enhanced learning policy and there's procedures associated with that. So the governance aspect of technology-enhanced learning, it may be part of a learning and teaching policy, but it really does need to be explicit about the use of technology. There is then a framework that an institution has, and that's what I go back to my original point, that something that unpacks for staff the fact that here's the policy, here's the procedures. Now, what aligns that to what we do in practice? And so there are some tools that we have available to us. ACODE provide a tool, which I'll talk about in just a sec. There's also this notion that there are some baseline standards. Now, standards are not a dirty word. They actually help us put some boundaries around what we do as an institution. And so if we have technology-enhanced learning standards, what they might say are things like, well, every unit of study needs to have that assessment in that one place. The last thing we want is our students going, if they're studying 4 units a semester, they're going into they're going into their LMS site and finding things in different places. Students know, we know that they want to know where their assessment is. So we put that in the same place every time. We want to know that they know where to find the communications, things like that. What's the button they push to get to speak to other students? We need to have those kind of standards in place to make it easier for our students to be able to navigate these different sites that we have very easily. Just helps that, particularly for those students who are less adept at technology. Those who have come in with NATAR 1 or 2, they'll find it. No worries at all. So those ones who have got NATAR 14 or 15, they're the ones we've got to worry about, because they are the retention. They're the ones we have to be really concerned about, retention and progression. And so lastly, there are baseline standards, and then there may be specific standards for fully online courses. Those things that we really want to make sure are present in a fully online course. I'm not going to go into huge depths on that, except to say that ACODE have developed, and in conjunction with Ascolite, we have our technology-enhanced learning framework, which is based on our benchmarks for technology-enhanced learning. So every second year, ACODE runs an online, or traditionally face-to-face, but last year was online, benchmarking activity where institutions come and rate them, compare what they're doing with each other on some scales, some performance indicators. And that helps us all as institutions understand the levels to which we can comply to the benchmark and how we are actually tracking against one another. And so these two are a companion set. If you are, for example, implementing the TEL framework, you would have no problems meeting the benchmarks, but that hasn't always been the case. And we started with the benchmarks and then developed up the framework after that. Then, of course, more recently, the Ascolite has brought out the TELAS online learning and assessment accreditation platform or framework that allows us to mediate the quality of our online courses and the areas that we use that online space for. An incredibly important document if we're looking to those online courses and providing that consistency there. So I would encourage you to look those up if you're not familiar with them, and to understand a little bit of what it means to provide a quality initiative within your institution. Of course, there are a whole range of different tools out there. There are hundreds of them, literally, across the globe. There's Commonwealth of Learning, bring one out. There's the Online Learning Consortium, have a quality scorecard. There's the Quality Matters rubric. There's the Ascolite TELAS one. Our framework, our threshold standards, learning guidelines. There are so many out there. They're probably the main ones that we see in the sector being used. It's really just a matter of making a choice. What one are you going to use? And then there's running with it. Excuse me. That makes up that part of your framework. What tool am I going to use? How am I going to apply it at your institution? At Griffith, we developed our course design standards, which are based around these particular elements of partnership-based learning, engaging parent pedagogies, scholarly-inspired curriculum, locally and globally connected, learner-enabled design, digital-enabled learning. And so there are a range of different elements in there which apply to all courses. And then at Griffith, particularly in the online courses, they use the Quality Matters rubric as well. I will draw your attention to an article I wrote last year. This is just one of the ads. It was called Putting the Pedagogy Course in Front of the Technology Cart. It's available on my blog site, michaelsankey.com. And I'm just going to run through a couple of things that sit in that blog that are relevant to this discussion today. So, for example, I'm a Viz Arts teacher. I went to arts college and I did pretty well. So well that, I became they said, hey, Sankey, you can be a sessional lecturer. You can help us get going with the first years and things like that. And I started doing that, and I started getting pretty good at that, and became a lecturer, level B lecturer. But typically, I was teaching in the way that I was taught, and I did my studies quite a few years ago now. But I was teaching the way I was taught, and so my students seem to be okay with that. Typically in the Viz Arts, you use a mastery model, like you stand and deliver. You show people, no, this is what Leonardo da Vinci did. That's what Van Gogh did, and look at that, the way he's painted that, and that's fine. You're delivering that with some visuals and things like that. That's fine, that's okay. And my teaching approach is based around that mastery model within the studio setting that I'm in. Well, that's fine, but I've been asked to do more in my teaching online. So, okay, I've got to teach more online. And I hear from others that we need to, oops, sorry about that. We need to be considering constructive alignment. Well, what on earth is constructive alignment? Well, we know it is the alignment of learning outcomes to assessment in simple terms. But what is, as a person who's never had to deal with that, what is that? And one day I want to become a senior lecturer at some point. And so I need to be conscious and really explicit about my teaching and my pedagogical approach, whatever that means, particularly as we start to use more blended modes of learning. What is my pedagogical approach? Well, in simple terms, pedagogy is that interaction between teachers and students and the learning environments and the tasks we do in the environment. And so, if I'm saying we're going to take a pedagogical approach, in broad terms, we're talking about constructivism, and that's been the main theme for the last 20, 30 years in higher education, this notion of constructivism, Vygotsky's notion we are working together. Instead of the sage on the stage, it's the coach and things like that. But now we've kind of evolved a whole new broad range of approaches. It's not as simple as that. And it's been out of need, and particularly as we moved in the online space, it's far more to do with new and more eclectic approaches to pedagogy than we've had in the past. And like, I kind of equate it to my set of golf clubs, okay? So I'm on the first, I've actually lived just behind a golf course here in Darwin. There's a lake there, and then there's over the other side, there's a golf course. So hole number 1 is 260 meters. And I know on hole number 1, I'm going to get my 2 wood and I'm going to whack it as hard as I can. Hopefully I'm going to get close enough to the green to lob onto the green with a 6-iron. And then hopefully I might pot out in 1 and get a birdie. We'll see how we go. The next hole low is 180 meters. So I'm not going to use my wood. I'm going to use a different combinations of clubs. I do know though that I'm going to use my putter. And in this example, the putter is assessment. And so there are different ways in which we use that. So what's illustrated in that article is this notion that there are different learning strategies and different learning theories. Now, the strategies are things, the OGs, the different OGs we have: pedagogy, andragogy, hudagogy, paragogy. Paragogy being a more recent phenomenon where it is all about how we co-construct our learning online and self-directed learning and things like that. Over the other side, there are the theories that underpin a lot of these pedagogies, like I mentioned earlier, constructivism, social constructivism, how we become more social in our learning environments and learn in a social context. The situated learning, particularly around professional skills and how we participate within that professional realm. If you're a nurse, for example, you're going to be doing a lot more situated learning than you are as a what would I say, as a fine arts student. And then, of course, there's connectivism and some of the theories around how we interface in peer networks and things like that. Associated with that, of course, then are our assessments, which we design assessment of learning, but there's also assessment for learning and assessment as learning. So there's different ways in which we think about assessment, and that's largely based upon the pedagogies and the theories. Of course, I'll be talking a little bit, unpacking a little bit about active, collaborative, authentic strategies in relation to our learning and teaching. So let's just dive into that very quickly. What is active learning? Well, it's where we start to see students engage at that analytical level. And it's how we get students to kind of make understanding of the materials and information that and not just passively absorbing this through traditional lectures and things like that. So we design tasks that require our students to be active and to do things in the online space and maybe physically as well, and then bring that back into the online space. And so, and this we've seen has a very positive impact on students' learning. There's buckets of relevant information about that, and I reference much of that in that article online. So that means active discussions. And so now I would say I'd be using Microsoft Teams to do that, and to get students not just sharing information, but going out and finding information and bringing it back in. We would be doing live debates. So we can do that within Teams through, or Zoom or Collaborate or whatever. And so getting the students to work in debating teams. We do it in the face-to-face environment. Why on earth don't we do it in the online environment? There was a good example of live debate. There's Escalite Group have a special mentoring scheme, and in the mentoring scheme the other week they had a live debate where some of the mentors and mentees worked together as a team and had a live debate around a particular topic. Excuse me. There are problem-solving activities we can do online where we simply pose a problem or a contentious statement and we get students to actually respond to that statement. Of course, there is more traditional case-based learning where we put a case to them and we'll get the students to develop up a case that would answer the requirements for the assessment. Simulations, of course, not necessarily, doesn't have to be in the AR, VR environment, but yes, ideally, if you've got the time and the energy to do that, please, I would encourage that because we're seeing some fantastic responses, some feedback from students in relation to that space. But simulations, there are many open source simulations you can incorporate into your learning management system now. Open source ones that are on many of the open source repositories, Merlot, etc., have a lot of those simulations. Could be simply a simulation with a 360-degree camera in that environment where you can tag things, for example. And so at Griffith, we use that as a way of letting people into scaffolding them into a workplace, for example. So instead of having to take them into a workplace, which has been difficult because of COVID, we would do a 360 image and tag various parts in the image. So for example, it was a nursing lab. We could say, here's the oxygen points, here's the defibrillator, this is what these things do. And so when you get in the lab, into the lab, student lab, or into the real life, you know what these things are before you get in there. So it lessens the burden in terms of the orientation towards different environments. Of course, they're role playing, getting students to play the role of somebody else. And this is really important, particularly as we get into more cross-disciplinary subjects and things like that. Peer teaching, incorporating other people into your teaching and getting people, and also peer learning, where students are actually working to teach a concept to another student. And what they have to do, of course, in doing that is, of course, go and investigate and be very active in that process. And of course, team projects and things. Now, I'm going to talk about a bit of collaborative learning and then authentic learning, but there's a lot of similarities in these. There's a lot of crossovers, but nuanced differences. So this relies on predominantly group structures. So collaboration, working together as a group rather than in the discussion forums where you might have discussion forums or Office 365 teams and things where people are mostly working as individuals, maybe touching across, but now we're talking about collaborative learning in groups, things that traditionally students had not liked doing, and they tell us that, but now with some of these newer technologies, they're getting more used to it. And so this is really where it involves two or more people learning something together, capitalizing off one another's resources and skills. And so how we integrate that into our program, that could be things like peer modeling, getting students to role play different elements of a group situation. So for example, you would say to one student, you're the CEO, you are this student here, you're the chief finance officer, and you are the chief technology officer. And the three of you are taking on that role and working through the different scenario that you might give them. You might send them on an online scavenger hunt for the team to go and find different things online related back to the topic of the week. Might be more informal debates than a more formal debate around a given topic where the team has to work together informally and more asynchronously. Then of course there are things like pass the problem, where the student will deliberately answer a question and pass the problem on to the next student, who then has to partly answer the question, add some more detail, and then goes on to the next student to add some more detail and things like that. Forming creativity groups where students brainstorm solutions to particular problems that you might have, etc. There are some really beautiful tools out there, and it's a tool known as Feedback Fruits, which has only been around for a few years now, but one we're looking at, one we used at Griffith really well, one we're looking at here at Charles Darwin at the moment, and a nice tool for that peer learning, peer collaborative learning, things like that. Authentic learning really is about gaining experience, listening and observing. It's where you discuss and explore, construct concepts to discover real world relationships, encouraging to critical thinkers and evaluate information, that kind of thing, build a professional identity from day one. So how do if I'm an engineering student, I'm an emerging engineer from day one of my studies, or I'm an emerging accountant, emerging nurse. How am I going to create my identity as a nurse, as an engineer? And it's part of how you create that online identity for yourself through whether it be an e-portfolio, how you link that to LinkedIn and other things. So it's building into them from day one that they are this emerging professional. Exposing them to various settings, activities, perspectives, things like that, through different practice skills. Excuse me, I'm just going to grab a little bit of water here. So it's getting a bit dry. If I'm a lecturer, I'm going to potentially put up an ill-defined problem that I need the students to solve, either in that group setting again, or individually. A task that's going to take some sustained investigation. So not something that can be answered straight away. So if they were following the COVID crisis, for example, what are the implications financially in the COVID crisis? No, it would, over a 12, 13-week period of a semester, that we know that it has evolved quite a bit. And so it's getting them to follow the news and to provide input based on that sustained model of investigation, allowing for multiple sources and perspectives. So what does the ABC say about this? What does Murdoch say about this? What does Google say about this? I mean, there are different, all these platforms are taking different perspectives on things. There's, of course, simple reflection. I've done something, now let me reflect on why I did that. Perspectives from various disciplines. So if I'm an arts lecturer or an arts student, what does it look like from being a finance student? What does it look like from being an engineer? What relationship can engineering have to arts? Well, it has quite a good relationship, actually, in terms of how things are designed. As an engineer, I want to consider how things look aesthetically. And so there can be cross-disciplinary activities like that. Assessment that is integrated, of course, to our learning outcomes, creation of products, of course, and labs in which we create things, and problems that may possibly have multiple solutions and outcomes, which is quite relevant nowadays. So to do that, though, nowadays, we need to be considering things like digital equity. That is, digital equity is not simply being digitally literate. That's about how to use technology. It's partly about being fluent in the digital space, how to achieve things, a desired outcome digitally. But more so now, it's about equity. It's about diversity and accessibility. And it relates to both access and inclusion. And there's far more to that than I've got time to go into now. The 2019 Horizon Report puts it really nicely. It's not merely maintaining the basic literacies by which students and instructors assess and evaluate information is no longer sufficient to support the complex needs of digitally mediated society. And it's exactly that. The times are changing. They really are. If somebody remembers that album, I do.
Speaking of time, Michael, we're unfortunately out of time. So if you'd like to wrap up,
yes. No worries.
I'll give you a minute to wrap up, if that's all right.
Yep. Cool. To do that, though, we're considering things like universal design for learning and the different aspects of that. I won't go into that, obviously. Now, I would say seek out information that's going to help you at an institutional level. There are things like white papers. We do things on invigilated exams, micro-credentials, returning to lectures. Who did that and why did they do that? What are we doing in relation to that institutions? These are all in the white papers that ACODE present. And I obviously took too much time to start with, but all those papers are available on the ACODE website, which I'd like to draw your attention to. But really what I'd like to get to the point is meet up with people who you know are quality people. So I'm involved with the Transforming Assessment group. I often go to their webinars, things like that. Hook up with people and institutions that have got really excellent resources on their websites, examples of this, and share this learning with others. Mentor others. Get involved with people you trust Lots of people are putting stuff online. There's a lot of crap online. But let's look for trusted sources. I go to Commonwealth of Learning, the Teleadvisors, Haskellite, JISC, Educause. These are trusted sources. Get involved with those sources, get involved with those organisations, and start to network within that space. Look, there you go.
Fantastic.